All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure there are a few more folks who are going to be coming in. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Palazzolo. I'm a social sciences librarian, head of collections at Emory University here in Atlanta. And I am happy to introduce our webinar, our PPIRS webinar for today from the Professional Development Committee. And just as a reminder that we are happy to have you participate via chat. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentations, but please let us know if you have any issues or anything of that sort. I'll be monitoring the chat as we go along. But again, welcome. And we had thought about doing this webinar for some time in terms of providing a little bit of a brief introduction to our guidance to approach general legal research questions that you may have, even though you may not be yourself a law librarian, but that you do receive those questions and how you might handle those. So our two speakers today, Robbie Siddell, who is a government information librarian at the University of North Texas, and Annalise Sklar, subject specialist for political science, law and security, and international government information at UC San Diego. Are going to lead us in a presentation discussing a number of the major themes and places to look, fee-based and free resources. And then, as I mentioned earlier, after these presentations, we'll take some questions and open it up for any discussion from our attendees. So I'm going to hand it off, mute myself, and hand it off to Robbie and to Annalise.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to start. As mentioned, I'm Robbie Siddell. I'm the Government Information Librarian at the University of North Texas. I don't serve as the subject librarian to political science. I actually serve as the liaison to the Department of Geography and the Environment. But I do oversee a branch library on our campus that does house our government documents as well as our legal collections and a few others of our general collections. I did not take any courses in legal informatics or even GovDocs when I was in library school. I've learned it all on the job. I was a public librarian prior to coming to the University of North Texas, and I think that's actually where I got most of my on-the-job training and learned kind of much of what I'll share with y'all today. And I have to say, I think the questions I got as a public librarian were probably more varied and interesting than what we get at the academic library today. So in a lot of ways, I miss it. I've included on the slide just a little bit about some of the programs that we offer that we may get questions related to legal information from. We do have a political science department. They offer a peace studies. They have a pre-law program as well. We do have a professional program that is a paralegal, but they don't, it's not an official university program, so they don't have access to our library resources, which is unfortunate. And we do get questions from across the university, as well as community members coming in because we are a federal depository library. UNT does have a College of Law, however, they are completely separate from us. The only resource we share in kind is Hein Online, and we're grateful they offer that to us. But other than that, we're kind of on our own. So I'm going to pass it to Annalise now.
Okay, so hello, I'm Annalise Sklar. I am the subject librarian for political science, law and society, and international government information. My job has changed over the last 15 years that I've been at UC San Diego, but I was originally hired to do political science and state, local, and international government information. And I have dabbled quite a bit in different management positions, and now I'm also the assistant program director for our scholarship tools and methods program. And my story is that on my first day on the job as a baby librarian, my first professional position, I was told, oh, by the way, you're going to be selecting the Ks too. And here's some lesson plans that the previous person who did for law and society. Good luck. So I am not a lawyer. I took one legal research class in library school. It was not my best class. I was sort of raised to be a government documents librarian. So I figured I could sort of figure it out as I was figuring out the rest of my job. UC San Diego does not have a law school. There are three actual law schools in San Diego County and 5 throughout the UC system. So we are an island, but we are not alone. There's also a public law library here in San Diego. The main courses that are law and society minor, but we also, political science now has a public law bachelor's specialization, and our student legal services department on campus started offering this Discover the Law certificate for students who are interested in pursuing law as a career. And so I started doing a workshop for them every year. We also have a paralegal program that is not officially supported by the library. And most of our students come from researchers and students in other departments, other disciplines, usually in the social sciences, but not always. So they are people who are very good at what they do, but they are not necessarily very expert at legal research, and they vary in scope, jurisdiction, topic. They are sort of random. Okay, next slide. So today we're going to talk about terms to help you search for legal information, the concept of secondary sources versus primary authority, citing legal documents and how to read legal citations. We're going to talk about some core databases and some of our favorite reference sources and how to learn more. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a slide I actually use with my Discover the Law students, and when I do my overview for them, I always start by trying to define the law. And so over the years, I've settled on this sort of very government doxy definition of the law as being the rules developed by legislative bodies, administrative agencies, and courts. Okay, next slide. And so this is a flowchart that demonstrates the complexity of the legal research process. It's an image that I actually found floating around on the web several years ago, and it's been widely reused by different people over the years. I know that it originates by the University of Arizona Law Library, and the original credit was a librarian named Sarah Gottschall. I've also seen it used in University of Arizona course materials created by Cynthia Condit. So if anybody actually knows who created this and it is not one of those people, please let me know and I will give proper credit. But I love this image because it doesn't sugarcoat how absolutely messy legal research can be and all the loops you can go in trying to find information. Okay, next slide, please. So one thing that's really key to note in that diagram on the previous slide is that step 1 is to consult secondary sources. And this is one of those things that maybe should have been a no-brainer for me. I certainly teach this to students in our introductory writing programs. Start with your secondary sources and then go back to your primary sources. But this was a giant aha moment for me when I heard it in the LexisNexis training webinar 10, 15 years ago, early in my career, that you want to start with these documents that will provide background information and introduce the legal discourse, and will have already compiled many lists of and citations to many of those primary sources for you, as well as citing other core secondary sources on your topic. So if you remember nothing else, that's probably your best bet when doing legal research. Okay, next slide. All right, so one key type of secondary sources are books, and the reason I include this is for a long time, I really struggled with the difference between some of these common types of legal books because, you don't necessarily use these terms otherwise. So a treatise is a book or a set of books that covers a single legal topic in depth. Horn books are a one-volume treatise. They're usually written for law students, and they typically cover subjects commonly covered in law school. So these are really useful as sort of introductory treatises, introductions to legal topics. And then case books are textbooks that can contain the text of cases, usually on a particular legal topic, and then with some commentary as well. And I will say, collection development wise, I've actually stopped buying case books because, again, we have the full text of the cases usually available in our databases. These books are expensive, and I've found that because they're often also used as textbooks, because they are expensive, they are also stolen from our collection. So I just sort of gave up. But they can be useful, and again, really great places to find all of that information in one nice bound volume. Okay, next slide.
All right, so as noted on the slide, law reviews are the scholarly journals of the legal world. They tend to offer analysis of a legal topic or issue and frequently address emerging legal concepts and present solutions to perceived legal problems. Law journals are typically published or generally published by law schools and are edited by law students. And for example, the Harvard Law Review boasts a number of esteemed alumni, including Barack Obama and Ketanji Brown Jackson, among Supreme Court justices, jurists, government officials, and academics. Law journals are available in print as well as through subscription databases such as Westlaw, Nexus Uni, and Hein Online, but many are now also being published as open access resources, so that's a plus. And then legal dictionaries is another type of secondary source that provide a good starting point to understand legal terminology or the legal use of a word. Legal dictionaries typically offer definitions for terms and include references to legal authority, cases, or usage in legal scenarios. Black's Law is probably the most commonly recognized and used legal dictionary. Most libraries will probably offer this resource in print, though Westlaw does provide it through their electronic access. And if you don't have Black's or any of the databases that we're going to talk about, there are some free legal dictionaries out on the web. We've included some on the slide for y'all to use.
So there are also 3 big legal encyclopedias in American law, and I totally admit that I initially created this slide for when I'm teaching because I always get them mixed up, but there are a few differences. So American Jurisprudence and Corpus Juris Secundum cover general U.S. law with an emphasis on case law. They have articles that can also be called titles. They can be hundreds of pages long, and each begins with a scope note and an outline. And both of them are included in Westlaw, but American Jurisprudence is also included in Nexus Uni. American Law Reports, on the other hand, combines elements of both encyclopedias and case reporters, and it contains selected illustrative cases, and then these cases are accompanied by annotations, which are articles summarizing legal issues and noting cases from around the country. Topics are more focused and they are more narrowed than in American Jurisprudence or Corpus Juris Secundum. And the articles are generally written on developing areas of law, so it can be something that is newer or there's less written about that's included in this publication, and this encyclopedia is only available in Westlaw. Okay, next slide. So moving over to primary authority now. This is an illustration of how the federal government works from an open textbook called Sources of the Law. And so just as an a refresher if you are not already, or an introduction if you are not already an accidental law librarian or government information librarian. So the Constitution is the supreme law of the United States, and it describes the three branches of government and their powers. And these three branches are supposed to check and balance each other. We know how that goes. Congress passes statutes, ratifies treaties, and creates administrative agencies. And the administrative agencies that are created oversee the day-to-day application of laws. The president proposes statutes, signs or vetoes statutes that have been passed by Congress, and oversees the administrative agencies. And then the federal courts interpret statutes, they create federal common law, and they review the constitutionality of statutes and other legal acts. Okay, next slide, please. And to illustrate this when I'm working with students, I'm not going to show this here, but I really like to use this three branches of government video from Schoolhouse Rock. It's called the three-ring government, and it equates the federal government to a three-ring circus, and it's very cute. So I do love to show that, even though I think I sometimes horrify the students because they don't know how to react. And it's available on YouTube on the Schoolhouse Rock channel. Okay, next slide. So this is another illustration from the open textbook Sources of the Law, and it shows how U.S. states are generally set up in a way that's similar to the federal government, though each state is slightly different in its own unique way. States generally have a constitution that will establish the state government and guarantee the rights of state residents. We have state legislatures, and they pass state statutes and create state agencies, and those state agencies oversee the day-to-day application of those state laws. The governor proposes statutes, signs or vetoes the statutes the legislature passes, and oversees those state agencies. And state courts then create state common law, interpret the statutes, and review the constitutionality of the statutes and other acts. Okay, next slide, please. And so this slide is actually for Nadine and our other colleagues in Canada. So this is a diagram from the Wilson Center Canada Institute, and it shows how Canada is similar with three branches of government and a bicameral legislature, but it's also totally different, as the head of state is the British monarch. And I just learned, for those of you who weren't here earlier, that the beaver is in fact the national animal of Canada. And so it is fitting that the beaver is used to represent the Prime Minister. Okay, next slide. And you know, in addition, there are 195 countries in this world, each with its own legal system. So this illustration is a color-coded map from Jury Globe, who are based at the University of Ottawa, and they classify countries by type of legal system. And I admit I really didn't think about this until I was looking for this illustration, but there are 4 core types of law that are common for governments to have. So you can have countries that are primarily civil law, which is defined as having drawn their inspiration largely from the Roman law heritage and gives precedence to written law. And then you have common law, which is generally based on the English common law concepts, and it assigns preeminent position to case law as opposed to legislation, which I hadn't really thought about because I think of the US as being a hybrid system, but you can notice the US is classified here as a common law system. And then there's customary law, and I found this great definition from this National Security Division Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism International Legal Services, an introduction document, which is a really great overview in 8 pages. And so customary law is more common in countries that don't have a strong formal justice system, and it is generally found at the tribal or local level in various districts, counties, villages, and it's, you know, the practices tend to vary from community to community. And these can be unique from each society or culture. And then there's also religious law, which is a tradition derived from traditional religious legal systems. And historically we've had Roman Catholic law and Anglican law and Talmudic law, but right now at the country level we primarily have countries implementing Islamic law, which is based on the Quran. And then again, a number of countries have a mixed system or borrow elements from one or more of these different methods of law. Okay, next slide, please.
And this is back to me. So the official legal, legislative, regulatory, and court documents themselves are what we generally describe as primary authority. In the US, that would include bills, statutes, and codes from the legislative branch, cases and rules of court from the judiciary, and executive orders and proclamations from the president, as well as regulations and regulatory decisions from executive agencies. And this, the first primary authority we're going to talk about are legislative materials or laws. The image on the slide is a crash course in how a bill becomes a law, courtesy of the Government Publishing Office. The process in a nutshell is that a bill is proposed. That's the proposed version of legislation. A legislature, state, or federal moves the bill through a series of steps, and then eventually it gets voted on and either approved and sent to the executive, or it's not approved. If it passes, it becomes a statute. Statutes are initially published as slip laws and then are bound together. At the federal level, the statutes at large are the chronological bound versions of all laws enacted by Congress during a given legislative session. Eventually, these statutes are rearranged by subject and published in the U.S. Code. In this scenario, a single statute could be scattered in the U.S. Code scenario. A single statute could be scattered across multiple volumes of the U.S. Code. It's also useful and important to know that many other documents are created during the legislative process. These might include hearings, debates, miscellaneous supporting information. A federal legislative history refers to all of the documents produced by and for Congress as a bill is introduced, considered, debated, and ultimately approved or not. The legislative history of a statute can be used to determine the intent of the legislature. Understanding the intent can bolster an argument for an ambiguous statute on how an ambiguous statute should be interpreted. And then once a bill becomes a law, it may need rules or regulations for its implementation. So the image on the slide is describing the basic rulemaking process. So when a statute needs a regulation, Congress delegates the power to issue those specific rules and regulations to an administrative agency that specializes in that area. In other words, when a law is passed by Congress, the law authorizes executive agencies to promulgate rules that interpret and fill in the administrative details of the law. These regulations have the force and effect of law. Agencies publish draft and final regulations in the Federal Register, and then final regulations are arranged by subject and published annually in the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. Like bills and statutes and codes, Federal Register notices, and rules published in the Oh, I haven't gotten to this point yet, so I'm going to skip that. Sorry, that'll come later. All right, so when I teach students about legislative and rulemaking process, I like to remind them that these are 2 points where they can weigh in and get involved in the process, that they can actually comment on or write to their Congress people to let their voice be heard through the process. So I just wanted to remind all of you that you can do the same. Now I'm going to pass it back to Annalise.
Okay, and as Chris pointed out in the chat, common law is based heavily on precedent, which is generally what is established through case law. And so this is a flow chart on how cases are published. And it's credited to Heather Simmons. And I found this on the Advanced Legal Research LibGuide from the University of Illinois Law Library. And so as I said earlier, the judicial branch interprets the law whenever there's confusion or conflict about its implementation or enforcement. And case law is found in the published written opinions of judges. And the published written part is the important part when you're doing research. And it includes the judge's decision and the reasoning behind it. And these opinions are published in series called reporters. And reporters contain the text of opinions and they're arranged chronologically. There are official reporters published by the government. And then there are commercial reporters published by a variety of publishers, but most notably the big publishers West and LexisNexis. The cases are then indexed in publications called digests, which I think we use less frequently now because they're sort of all blurred together in databases. And the digests may be broken down by topic or geography. There are a number of sort of classic sets out there. And like statutes and regulations, opinions are first published individually as slip opinions, like the slip laws, and then they're bound together chronologically in a hardbound. They're bound in a hardbound reporter. Okay, next slide, please. So I get a lot of questions by researchers who are looking for documents other than case law, because it couldn't be easy enough for them to be looking for the published opinions that are readily available. So people are often looking for court transcripts or briefs, and they're surprised to find out how tricky this can be. So borrowing heavily from a great guide I discovered by my colleagues at the University of San Diego, who is not the same as UC San Diego, but they are just up the road. They have a great LibGuide on dockets, and they define a docket as a chart listing all of the documents that have been filed with the court in the proceedings of a case. Each case has an identifying docket number, so this can help you go back and find all of the documents that are part of this docket, and the docket will show the names of the parties and their attorneys and the judge who's been assigned to the case. It'll also show the date the case was filed and the date of all the filings and proceedings. So it can give you a lot of information about the documents and sort of about the process of the case. And so some of these documents can be downloaded for free. A lot of them have a fee, and some of them aren't online at all. Every court is different. And so usually when you're looking at lower level courts, lower level local state courts, there aren't going to be written opinions at all. And so if people need primary documents, they're going to be hidden in these dockets. And then there are also all sorts of documents that are not part of the published opinion in the cases that do have published opinions. At the federal level, the database for acquiring these documents is called PACER, which is a cute acronym for Public Access to Court Electronic Records. And one thing that people are surprised to find out is that they charge you per page of search results. They charge you 10 cents a piece, but they do waive the fee if you only rack up under $30 per quarter, but you do have to give them a credit card to get started, which is often a non-starter for students. Sometimes that's a problem for other researchers as well, but it's often a problem for students. There are sort of constantly bills that are being introduced to open up PACER. There's one in the Senate right now called the Open Courts Act that would make PACER or its successor be a free tool so that everybody has access to this legal material. In the meantime, there are projects to try to remedy or circumvent this situation. And a big one is called RECAP, which is PACER Backward, and it's a project by the Free Law Project. And they archive documents that users have downloaded from PACER so that once it's been pulled out of PACER, it can be served back up for free. And they have a Chrome plugin. So anybody who has this Chrome plugin and then goes into PACER and downloads material will automatically be uploaded into the Free Law Project into RECAP. This is a really great tool if you're just getting started for looking for documents in the docket. You may not find the full text article, but you may at least find a list of documents that are part of that docket so that you can make decisions about whether or not you want to go through the whole process of PACER. And it can certainly keep your PACER bill down if you're only going into PACER to retrieve the specific documents. And then another tip, also just, this is where mad Googling can help. If it's a case that's been notable, journalists or researchers may post copies of the documents that they've had to pay for freely online on their websites or, in various document hosting services. So it never hurts to look and see what's out there, even though it won't necessarily be a comprehensive search. It may be the key, most interesting, largest documents that are part of the docket. And Nadine is saying that law firms may also post documents from the dockets if they're especially if they're handling, again, a big notable case or a big important case. Okay, next slide, please. And so going hand in hand with that tip, sometimes you may be looking at other sources. Sometimes the path of least resistance may be to go look at other what historians would call primary sources, but what legal experts would still say have secondary authority. Sources like news articles, especially useful for accounts of sensational cases. Government publications and official documents, first-person accounts, especially for historic cases. You may get a lot of information from these non-legal documents as well. Okay, next slide, and back over to Robbie.
Thanks. Now we're going to talk about legal citations for a minute or two. So the Blue Book, a uniform system of citations, is probably the primary style guide folks use for legal materials. And there are other style guides out there. They often will typically refer back to the Blue Book. Blue Book is available online through a subscription. We still order this one in print because it's nice to have on hand, but they do have on their website a free quick style guide that is really very useful in sort of a quick reference to see the different parts and how legal citations are formatted. And legal citations typically follow a standard format and consist of 3 basic parts, and that is the name of the case, statute, or article. 2, a statement of where the item can be found in a multi-volume set of legal materials, which may be an abbreviation. We'll talk more about it as we move along. And it often will also include a page number, and then legal citations typically will also have a date, which can be incredibly important and helpful. So in the example on the screen, the case name is Scaft v. Rorex, and it was published in the 553rd volume of the Pacific Reporter Second Series and can be found on page 830. And this citation not only includes the date, but also includes the court jurisdiction of Colorado. Let's see, you can also sometimes have a publisher-specific citation from someplace like Westlaw or Lexis. If you do happen to have one of these, it's typically less useful to relocate that case unless you have access to either a Westlaw database or a Nexus or a Lexis database. We had somebody come in the other day with a bunch of Westlaw citations, and we don't have Westlaw, but some people published information on the web, so we were able to locate a few of the actual case citations to help him find those. But if you're struggling to read citations, just as a note, because you might not know what the P.2D is, BYU Law Library has a really great list of reporter abbreviations. So the Pacific Second Series is a reporter, and then the image below is actually a federal case. So it shows the case name, Brown versus Board, as well as the volume of the U.S. Reporter and the page number on which you can find that case. And then here are a few other examples of legal citations. So there are case citations, but then all of those materials that get produced in the process of creating laws also get their own citations. And what I find really helpful and interesting is that the citations can kind of give you breadcrumb trails of where that item is through the legislative or administrative process. So if it's a bill, it has one number. When it becomes a public law, that's more the slip law. It has a number, then it gets its statute number, and then eventually its number in the U.S. Code. And state level are a little bit different than the federal level. And state by state, they're completely different. What we have here for California law would not be the same that we have for Texas state law. And then on the right of the screen are a few examples of administrative citations, both at the federal and state level. So the Federal Register citation might be when it's a proposed rule, then it gets codified in the CFR, and so we have that citation, and then the two are comparable comparisons to what we do here in Texas. And now we're going to talk about legal databases.
And no webinar on legal research would be complete without talking about legal databases. Westlaw and LexisNexis have been two big competitors for years, I think over a century, maybe a century and a half by now, maybe more. And the content on their platforms is fairly similar. They both have court opinions, statutory codes, law reviews, and other secondary sources. Where they differ is their search interface, and then they have proprietary commentary or annotation of cases and codes. Next slide.
And so Nexus Uni is the first that we're going to cover. It may be one that is more familiar to folks on this call. It tends to be a multidisciplinary database. It includes business information as well as news sources in addition to legal information. It is part of the Reed Elsevier conglomerate, I guess, for lack of a better word. But it does, and it also includes, as far as legal information, it has a lot of state level information. So I like it for that reason. It does also have federal information. It contains tribal court information, and it does offer some international coverage as well. And within Nexus Uni is the shepherdizing. So folks may hear or have heard at some point in their lives about shepherds or shepherdizing. It is defined as a legal research method of locating reports of appeals decisions based on prior precedents from Shepard citation books. which list the volume and page number of published reports of every appeal court decision, citing previously decided cases or statutes. There are some examples of Shepard's volumes on the slide. Some of you may have these in your library. Some of you may not. The purchase of the print editions of Shepard's has declined steadily since the early 2000s. Both Nexus Uni and LexisNexis provide Shepard citations for statutes, regulations, and cases. The Shepardizing tools available in the databases include a signaling system similar to Westlaw's KeyCite, which Annalise is going to talk about in just a minute or two. And I have linked on the slide a guide to understanding the Shepard signals. So when you see those in the database, if you're looking at a case, it'll let you know whether or not that decision is in good standing, whether or not it's been overruled or deemed unconstitutional, or even if a law or rule has been superseded.
Okay, so moving on to Westlaw, the other big conglomerate. They are, as Nadine pointed out in the chat, a Thomson Reuters product, so you can decide which big conglomerate you want to deal with. I find Westlaw to be the best bet for appellate level cases, law reviews, other secondary sources. As I mentioned, they have their proprietary commentary. They have a search. They used to have a really terrible search interface, but their current search interface is students really like it. It's fairly straightforward. It is a little less tricky than Nexus Uni, though sometimes I feel like Nexus Uni might have deeper content. Westlaw primarily has a US focus, or at least the version that is sold to us, though there is some content from other jurisdictions. I was surprised to see coverage of Australia, Canada, and the other Commonwealth or former Commonwealth countries. I usually go to Nexus Uni for that, but I saw that was actually in there when I went looking. It also has EU content. What else? It's got the cases. It has, one of the things that is sort of interesting to me is both Westlaw and Nexus Uni, they say they have statutes, but they actually have the statutory codes rather than the statutes in the chronological order that they are passed. There are court rules, regulations, administrative decisions. There are briefs, I believe, for the Supreme Court. If you dig deep enough, there was some proposed and enacted legislation and some bill tracking, and it had proposed and adopted regulations from the Federal Register. One of the other things about these databases, they both have a proprietary version of the US code. So in Westlaw, it's USCA, US Code Annotated, which its name sort of speaks for itself. And they have their proprietary versions of US reports. So the Westlaw version is the Supreme Court Reporter. And as Robbie mentioned, when you have a citation for one, you might not necessarily be able to find it in the other because the page number, the volumes and page numbers are going to be different. I believe both databases often will map to each other, but not always. And then both databases have secondary sources, so there's lots of law review content, journals, there's a whole variety of texts and treatises and other practice materials. Your mileage may vary on how useful the particular titles are for you. And then I mentioned Westlaw has American law reports, American jurisprudence, and corpus juris secundum. So there's a lot buried in there if you keep digging. Okay, next slide. So West's alternative to Shepardizing is called KeyCite. In Nexus Uni, you'll see these little images that are, there's a little red hexagon that means the case has been overruled. In Westlaw, it's a red flag. In Nexus Uni, you'll see a little yellow triangle that's kind of like an upside down yield sign. In Westlaw, it's a yellow flag. But this is one of the things that's really powerful about these databases is you have that clue to determine whether or not this case law is still valid, as well as connecting out to the other cases that it cites or that cite it. So that is the powerful thing behind these databases. Next slide. And then the other feature of Westlaw, so Nexus Uni has always, LexisNexis has claimed to fame as shepherdizing. West's true claim to fame is the key number system. And these are really highly detailed, it's a really highly detailed indexing system. And each head note attached to each case is assigned a key number, and you can find other cases that deal with that same very specific point of law by searching by key number. And you can search directly by key number, or you can click on it in the cases. If you have ever taken a legal research class, you actually have to go to a print volume and search for the key number and then find the citations to cases and then go back and find the full text, or at least that was my experience. Maybe they don't make people do that in paper anymore, but you realize the beauty of the key number system when you remember that once upon a time you couldn't just keyword search. All right, next slide, please.
So I'm just going to talk briefly about Hein Online. It's a fairly comprehensive legal database that connects users to U.S. statutes, regulations, and other government publications, as well as law reviews, case law, and some historical and international legal information. One thing that Hein has started doing recently is creating these curated databases that bring together topical resources on specific collections. Hein is not always my go-to, but I do like it for the librarian folk. It's really easy to get access to the lists of resources available within their databases, and you can get MARC records if you want to include those in your catalog.
And the final database I wanted to talk about is actually one that neither Robbie or I subscribe to. It's called VLEX, and it's one that I've been really interested in because they have incredible global content. You may be familiar with the company that they merged with a few years ago called Justice, which was the big company for UK and Canadian and other Commonwealth or former Commonwealth countries. But they have a very impressive looking interface. They are touting that they have Vincent, an AI-powered legal research assistant that will learn your legal research habits and try to serve you the best content from the database. You can buy some of these different regions in modules, or you can buy their entire database. But if you have people who do a lot of non-US law, this is probably a product to look into. Okay, next slide. So, okay, so moving on from the databases, there are, now that we've shown the very expensive databases, there are a number of places to get some of this content available for free. And so, may not have the bells and whistles, but sometimes, especially if you're a student in a class, you don't want all the head notes, you don't really understand them. You just want the plain case that you're supposed to read for class. And so you can get those directly from GovInfo. You can get cases from Justia. They I think have the largest collection of free cases now. Cases, published opinions are in Google Scholar. And then if you deal with political scientists, you may sometimes get asked for bulk data. And Court Listener and the Case Law Access Project are both good sources for bulk legal data. Also, there's a product we didn't talk about called LLMC, which was originally the Law Library Microform Consortium, I believe. And they have been digitizing many primary sources, including foreign primary sources and US primary sources, but they were willing to work with one of my researchers to provide bulk data. So they have an interesting model where if you are a Center for Research Libraries member, but you do not have a law school, you should have free access to LLMC. So they're sort of one of those hidden gems. Okay, next slide, and back to Robbie.
Yeah, we're running short on time, so I'm going to kind of blow through this really quickly. These are a few free resources for federal legislation and federal legislative materials. Congress.gov is sort of the legislative process type resource. GovInfo tends to have things, they do have bills, but they also offer all of the enacted legislation once it's published as a statute or a US code. The Legal Information Institute at Cornell is another great resource. And then just to encourage folks to explore what LibGuides your fellow librarians have put out there. So we've all probably created extensive lists of materials which are useful. And then a few notes about bulk data. GovInfo does offer bulk data downloads as well as the United States Project. And then just briefly about federal regulations. These are some similar to what was on the prior slide. Regulations.gov is more the proposed process. So if you want to get involved again in commenting on a proposed regulation, that's a great place to go. Everything is published in the Federal Register, which is sort of the daily newspaper for the federal government, like the classified ads, sort of, so to speak. And then ECFR is once a regulation is codified, you can find the current version there. GovInfo has both current and historic versions. And then I did include just that authenticated US government information image on the slide, just to show that if you see that on a GovInfo thing, it is a guarantee from GPO that the information is authenticated and not tampered with. And then, of course, some of our not free things. And then presidential information, because it's also part of the legal information, the body of legal information. The American Presidency Project is probably the most comprehensive free resource out there. And then a few other resources listed on the slide as well.
All right, I popped out of my my notes. So for sources for state law, Godort has this incredible state agency database project, so that's a great place to look. If you are not familiar with the Law Library of Congress, they have some fantastic LibGuides. They're one of my go-tos. Hein Online is actually my favorite database for state legal information. They're the only place that has a separate module you can buy that has the full text of session laws. And these two reference sources, the National Survey of State Laws and the Subject Compilation of State Laws, are incredible if you have researchers who are trying to do 50 state comparative projects, because that's really difficult because you're comparing 50 states. And again, there's content in Nexus Uni and Westlaw. And then Open States is a good resource for bulk state data as well. Next slide. For foreign law, again, Law Library of Congress is usually my go-to. If I get something that's non-US, I go to one of their guides and use whatever resources they recommend. There's also GlobalX from NYU Law, who have really great guides. The World Legal Information Institute pulls in information from all of the legal information institutes around the world, and they have databases of case law and other legal materials. Again, the big databases. I was pleasantly surprised to discover the Canadian Acts of Parliament in Hein Online, as well as the constitutions, and these various topical databases from IGOs like FAO Lex and NAT Lex from the ILO and RefWorld and so on and so forth. Next slide. And for international law, again, Global Lex, I love the guides from the United Nations Dag Hammarskjöld Library. I also often look at guides from the various UN depository libraries. I'm in the UC system, so I use Jim Church's guides at Berkeley a lot. Again, the Law Library of Congress has some good guides. And if you're looking for the full text of treaties, Hein Online is probably your go-to place. Okay, next slide. I think we're going right up to the wire here. If you can't tell, we highly recommend looking at other people's LibGuides. We've linked to ours here in the slides. I also, my pro tip is to go find the law library in the area that you are researching. So, if I'm looking for information in Alabama, I'm going to go find a library in Alabama and look at their guides, because they're going to know local information better than I will. There are a couple of great online reference books that are free. There's Locating the Law, a handbook for non-law librarians by the Southern California Association of Law Libraries, and the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C.'s Legislative Source Book. Those are great go-tos. They're fairly up to date. A couple, I think Nadine mentioned this in the chat, but one series that's really useful is that I learned about in library school. West has a book series called The Nutshells, and they cover sort of every topic of law. They put out new editions every few years. They're they're short paperbacks. They're not very expensive. You can buy them as ebooks. I buy them through Gobi, and I buy them on the EBSCO platform now. And then also, if you help people with their own personal legal problems, the Nolo Press is a great legal self-help press. They have guides on things like tenant law and copyright and patents. So they cover a lot of topics that are really, really useful to people who might be affiliated with a college or university campus. And they're not very expensive. And they also have an online database through EBSCO called the NOLO Legal Information Reference Center, which we actually can access through our local public law library, which is really, really great because they are the most up to date that way. Okay, next slide.
So we just wanted to remind folks that there are lots of ways to get help. Some of these things we've talked about throughout. The PPIRS series, of course, you're here because you got notified of that. Godort offers a couple of our own series. If you're not familiar with Godort, that's the Government Documents Roundtable from ALA. We have our help series. We're also hosting Friday chats. We're always looking for topics for those. So if you have things that you want to learn more about, reach out to Godort and we can add those possibly as a chat or a help event. The Law Library of Congress has their Legal Research Institute. Of course, all of the vendors offer their own webinars and training resources, and then perhaps your local library will also offer help and training and resources.
So I'm going to just jump in here because we have like 1 minute, if you don't mind.
Yes, and we are. This is our second to last slide, I think. So
Okay.
we are at time.
Okay.
But yes, a shout out to PPIRS and a shout out to Godort, and their listservs. PPIRS has a free listserv, and GovDocL is a free big listserv for government information. And We were hoping to have time, but we did finish just at the wire. I'm willing to stick around if folks have questions or want to keep chatting, but you do not have to stay if you do not want to stay.
And I assume we'll share the slides as
We
well.
will share the slides.
Awesome. This is amazingly great. This is wonderful. I learned a ton and just really good stuff.
Well, thank you. And there's been some great conversation in the chat and some
Yes.
great information shared. So thank you everybody for just keeping that conversation going. We do encourage you to share other resources, either on the PPIRS listserv or the Godort listserv, or share questions on those lists as well.
Awesome. Thank you very
The
much.
other one that I added to the chat is FDLP, the Federal Depository